I was 13 years old when something happened that, to this day, makes me uncomfortable whenever I remember. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was at home with my parents when we heard loud knocks on the front door. When my father opened it, our neighbor was there, red with anger, shouting things that at first we couldn't even understand properly. He pointed his finger at us and said that the noise of our rabbit was driving him crazy. At the time, I thought that was absurd, because the rabbit was in a small house in the backyard and barely made sound. Even so, the man was out of control. He started screaming louder, saying that he would end it once and for all if we didn't do something immediately. My father tried to stay calm, asking him to calm down and talk, but the threat was clear, and that left me in shock. I stood still in the hallway, peeking through the doorway, and I remember the fear I felt when I saw his expression. It wasn't just irritation. There was something disturbing in his eyes, as if he was really able to fulfill the threat. My mother pulled me into the living room and told me not to get close to the window, but I could hear everything. His tone of voice was heavy, full of hatred for something that simply didn't make sense. After a few minutes of discussion, the neighbor left, slamming the door so hard that the frame even trembled. We were silent for a while, trying to digest what had just happened. My father closed all the windows and locked the doors, which we never did in the middle of the afternoon, but you could see that he was also shaken. That transformed the atmosphere of the house, leaving everyone on alert. That night, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept hearing every little noise in the backyard, afraid that the neighbor would try to do something against the rabbit. The cage was near the fence that separated our land, and any movement seemed suspicious to me. I even got out of bed twice to look out the window, but I only saw the backyard illuminated by the dim light of the street pole. My parents tried to reassure me, saying that the neighbor was probably just stressed and that he wouldn't really do anything. But I knew there was something strange in that look and in the way he spoke. It wasn't a common complaint. It looked more like a promise. The weather got heavy in the following days, and every time I saw the man leaving the house, I felt that same chill. 2 days later, something happened that only reinforced my fear. We woke up with the sound of something hitting the backyard fence. When my father went out to check, he found kick marks on the wood, right in the closest part of the rabbit house. There was no way not to link this to the neighbor, even more so because he had made the threat in broad daylight. My father didn't say much, but I saw on his face that he was worried. That morning, he decided to move the rabbit house near the wall of our house, where it would be more difficult for someone to move without being seen. I helped, but all the time I was looking at the neighbor's backyard, hoping to see him peeking behind the window. I've never really seen it, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me all day. For a few weeks, we tried to follow the routine normally, but the tension never completely disappeared. Every time the neighbor passed in front of our house, he seemed to stare at the backyard, as if he still had that in his head. I avoided going out alone to play in the garden, and even my parents began to take turns checking the doors before going to sleep. It was as if we were always waiting for something to happen. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night with my dog growling low near the back door. When I approached, I saw that the light in the neighbor's backyard was on, but there was no one outside. Even so, the dog was still restless, as if he had felt something. I stood there in silence, listening to the growl, and I was sure it wasn't just my imagination. There was a real threat behind that man. The next morning, I found my father talking in a low voice with my mother in the kitchen. He said that if things continued like this, maybe it would be better to call the police to record what was happening. This made me even more nervous, because I realized that he was also afraid of something worse happening. It wasn't just a grumpy neighbor. There was a real risk, and my parents knew it. After that day, we started to keep the outdoor lights on all night, which we had never done before. I felt safer that way, but at the same time, it was strange to think that we needed to turn our house into something like a fortress because of someone who lived right next door. The rabbit was still in the backyard, but now under constant surveillance, and this showed how much our peace had been broken. Time passed, but the tension never completely disappeared. Whenever we heard any louder noise coming from the street, we ran to check the backyard. Sometimes it was just the wind or some animal, but the fear that it was the neighbor hanging around again never left our heads. It was like living in a state of alertness, waiting for something that might never come, but that seemed possible at any time. I was only 13 years old, but that marked my way of seeing people. I never imagined that someone could feel so much hatred for something as small and harmless as a rabbit. Since then, I have become much more suspicious of neighbors and realized that you can't always trust just because someone lives near you. Over time, The direct threats stopped mid, but the feeling of insecurity remained. The neighbor never knocked on our door again, but whenever we crossed paths with him in the backyard or on the street, it was impossible not to remember that afternoon when he shouted promising to end that once and for all. To this day, just hearing loud knocks on a door, my body reacts as if it were back to that day. This experience showed me that true fear does not always come from distant strangers, but can live right next door. And you? Have you ever had a neighbor who crossed the line to the point of leaving you scared inside your own house? Story 2. At first I didn't give much importance. I thought it was just a coincidence that my neighbor in front, a lady who lived alone, always showed up when I got home from work. Sometimes she was watering the plants, other times coincidentally, she went out to get the correspondence. But over time it became clear that she paid too much attention to our routine. What made me really uncomfortable was when I realized that she carried a camera on several of these occasions. It wasn't a cell phone camera, but one of those old ones with a big lens. I noticed that she lifted it up in a subtle way, as if she were fixing or cleaning, but always pointed in the direction of my house, especially for me and my family when we were in the backyard. I told my husband, but he thought I was exaggerating, until the day he himself noticed the discreet flash coming from the camera while the children played. From there, the situation stopped being just strange and became disturbing. We started to avoid staying in the backyard for a long time, always with the feeling that we were being watched. A few weeks later, an unexpected opportunity arose to confirm what I feared. Her son showed up on a weekend to help her organize some things, and asked for my help to carry a heavy box. When I entered the neighbor's room, I saw several albums open on the table. I couldn't resist looking, and that's when the shock came. Inside the albums there were dozens of photos of us. Some were old, others recent, but all taken without us knowing. Photos of me arriving from work, of children running through the backyard, even images of my husband sitting on the balcony reading newspaper. Nothing artistic, nothing by chance, they were direct records of our routine. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, trying to understand the reason. Her son noticed my expression and quickly closed the albums, as if he wanted to disguise it. He didn't say anything, just thanked for the help and changed the subject, but the way he acted only confirmed that he knew exactly what was happening. I returned home feeling exposed, as if my privacy had been invaded in a way I never imagined. I told my husband everything, and this time he believed without question. We decided to avoid any direct contact with the neighbor, but it was impossible not to feel discomfort every time we saw her at the window. It seemed that she was always waiting for the right moment to watch us. The children started to notice too. My oldest daughter commented that she had seen the neighbor staring at the backyard for almost an hour, without moving. This made me even more disturbed, because I realized that it wasn't just me. We were all being watched constantly inside our own house. As the weeks went by, I realized that I could no longer relax even inside the house. Any noise from outside made me run to the window to check if she was there. And most of the time, I was really standing still looking directly at our house, as if that were the most normal thing in the world. My husband suggested talking to her, but just the idea of confronting her made me nervous. The worst was one night when I went out to close the garage, I saw the reflection of her camera behind the curtain. She was inside her own house, photographing ours, even at night. That was the point where I realized that it wasn't just a nuisance, it was an obsession. And as scary as it was, I didn't know how to deal with it without making the situation worse. After this episode, we installed thick curtains on all the windows and avoided using the backyard as before. Little by little, we moved as far as possible away from that neighbor's presence, although she kept wandering around, always with that camera in her hand. To this day, when I remember the albums full of our photos, I feel a chill. It was as if we were living in a reality show without giving permission. I could never look at her the same way, nor cross the street without feeling that I was being recorded in some way. The feeling of being watched, inside and outside the home, is something that completely changes the way you live. And you, what would you do if you found out that a lonely neighbor has dozens of photos of you saved in albums? Story 3. When I moved to that small apartment, I thought I would finally have a quiet space to study and focus on college. At first, it seemed perfect, but as the weeks went by, I began to notice a strange detail. Whenever I got home, the upstairs neighbor's door opened. It didn't matter the time. It could be in the morning, afternoon, or even dawn. He found a way to show up. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, maybe he had a routine similar to mine. But over time it became clear that it was not that. On several occasions, I arrived after a tiring day, and seconds after putting the key in the door, I heard the click of his door opening up there. He stood still on the stop, as if he was waiting exactly for that moment. The situation became even more uncomfortable when I began to notice the way he looked at me. There was no smile, no attempt to talk, just a fixed look, almost invasive. It was as if he wanted to make it clear that he knew every time I entered or left the apartment. I even commented with college colleagues, and everyone said it was probably something in my head, but I knew it wasn't. Things got worse on some specific nights. I came home late and found the neighbor standing in the hallway, this time wearing only underwear. He didn't say anything, he just stared at me in silence while I passed by. I tried to act naturally, quickly entered my apartment and locked the door, but my heart was racing, feeling completely exposed inside my own home. After that, I started to change my routine. I went up the stairs in silence, trying not to make noise when putting the key on the door, just to avoid getting his attention. Even so, it seemed useless. Whenever I least expected it, he was up there, the door ajar, watching. In some moments I could even swear that I heard his steps following mine through the ceiling, as if he knew exactly where I was inside the apartment. I even considered talking to him directly, but just the memory of that stare made me give up. The truth is that it didn't seem like a simple weird habit. There was something in the way he put himself, motionless, as if he was testing how far I would endure that constant surveillance. Every day I felt more pressured, as if I had no privacy at all. One night, when I came back later than usual, I realized that the corridor was completely silent. For a moment, I thought I would finally be able to enter the house without crossing paths with him. But as soon as I closed the door behind me, I heard heavy steps coming from upstairs, walking from one side to the other. It was as if he had been waiting just to confirm that I had arrived. I stood still, leaning against the door, listening to each step echoing through the ceiling. The feeling was suffocating, as if the whole space had turned into a resonance box, projecting his every movement directly into my apartment. That was the first time I seriously thought about moving, even though I knew I wouldn't have the financial conditions for it so soon. Over time, the situation only got worse. There was a night when I opened the door to pick up a delivery, I almost came across him going down the stairs, again wearing only underwear. He didn't say anything, he didn't make any gesture, he just stood still for a few seconds looking directly at me, as if he were analyzing my every reaction. I hurriedly closed the door and leaned against it, with my heart racing, trying to understand how far that could go. The most disturbing thing was the naturalness with which he did these things, as if there was nothing wrong with being in the hallway like that. There was never a conversation, a justification, nothing. Just that fixed and silent gaze, which gradually turned into something almost threatening. Every time I got home, I wondered if he would be there again waiting. In the end, I started to avoid staying in the apartment as much as possible. I spent more time in the library, in cafes, or even sleeping at friends' house, just to not deal with that discomfort. Nothing ever happened but his looks and presence in the hallway, but that's exactly what made everything worse. The feeling that he was just waiting for the right moment to do something. I never had enough evidence to call the administration or the police, but to this day I remember the feeling of being constantly watched. After I finally managed to move, the relief was immediate, but the impact remained. To this day, whenever I enter a silent building corridor, I feel that cold in my stomach, as if I were going to find the same fixed gaze as before. And you, what would you do if you had a neighbor who showed up every time you got home, just to stare at you in silence? Story 4. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. I live on the 3rd floor of a small building, and my downstairs neighbor always spent a lot of time on the balcony. But as the weeks went by, I began to realize that there was something wrong. Every night, without exception, he sat there, facing directly to my bedroom window. I never said anything, I never messed with my cell phone, I just stood still, staring up. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. I closed the curtains, but whenever I forgot to pull them completely, there he was, motionless, looking at my room as if he was expecting something. I commented to friends and family, but most thought it was an exaggeration, because he had never done anything but look. But for me, that constant look was enough to take away my peace. Things got worse on a specific dawn. I woke up thirsty and went to the kitchen to drink water. On the way, I passed through the corridor of the apartment and noticed a strange light coming from under the entrance door. I looked through the peephole and froze. The neighbor, who was usually on the balcony, was now standing right in front of my door. The light in the building's corridor was on, illuminating his face. He didn't knock, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, standing still, looking directly at the door, as if he knew I was watching. My heart raced, and I walked away slowly, without making noise, until I returned to the room. I stayed up until dawn, afraid that he would try something. The next morning, I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but inside me I was terrified. I passed by the neighbor quickly when I left for work, and he greeted me in a normal way, as if he hadn't been standing in front of my door a few hours before. That made me even more uncomfortable, because his naturalness only reinforced the feeling that it had not been a coincidence. I started to pay more attention to the schedules. I realized that, invariably around 10 p.m., he was already on the balcony looking up. And on at least 2 different occasions, I heard slow steps in the hallway of the building at dawn, when everyone was already sleeping. I didn't have the courage to open the door to confirm, but I knew it was him. I started living in constant alert. I locked the door twice, checked all the windows, and even left some lights on during the night, just to feel a little safer. Even so, the discomfort did not diminish. Every time I opened the bedroom curtain, even for a few seconds, he was already downstairs, watching me. The repetition of this began to mess with my head. One night, I called a friend while I was still in the room, on purpose, talking out loud as if I had company. I even thought that, maybe if he realized that I was never really alone, he would give up. But when I went to spy, there he was again, sitting on the balcony, motionless, looking up as if he hadn't heard anything. The scariest episode happened when I woke up in the middle of the night with a slight noise, as if someone had touched the doorknob. I went to the corridor in silence and realized that the light in the hall was off this time, but I could still see someone's shadow projected under the door. My whole body crashed, and I stood still, without the courage to look through the peephole. I stayed there for long minutes until the sound stopped and silence took over again. When I finally gathered the courage to look, there was no one else. I went back to the room and could barely sleep after that, just thinking that someone, most likely him, had been standing right there, outside, trying the handle. My stomach was turning. Shortly after, I started looking for another place to live. That environment no longer seemed safe, and the simple idea of continuing to live with the constant presence of that neighbor was unbearable. I managed to move a few months later, but to this day I remember the suffocating feeling of being observed every night, without truce. I've never been able to sleep peacefully in an apartment without first checking 1,000 times who lives nearby. The most disturbing thing is to think that he never said or did anything directly, but managed to destroy my peace only with a fixed gaze and insistent presence. And you, what would you do if you noticed that your neighbor spent every night watching your window and, in the middle of the night, appeared standing in front of your door? Story 5. I've always had the habit of checking all the doors before going to sleep. I live in a single-story house, and this has always been a concern of mine. That night, I did the same routine as always. I locked the front door, checked the windows, and finally the back door. Everything was safe, as usual. But a few hours later, I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange noise coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was the wind or some animal moving outside, but when I got close, I saw the scene that left me on full alert. The back door was open, and the lock seemed to have been forced. The latch was damaged, as if someone had used a tool to try to break it. I felt my heart race when I realized that it was not an accident. Someone had really tried to get in. I quickly looked at the backyard, and under the dim light of the street pole, I noticed footprints on the wet earth, probably because of the rain that had fallen in the late afternoon. The footprints went towards the fence at the bottom of the backyard, but suddenly stopped, as if the person had jumped on top or simply disappeared from there. The sight of those marks left me paralyzed for a few seconds. I ran back inside and locked the door as I could, even though I knew the lock was already damaged. I spent the rest of the night on alert, walking around the house, checking every corner, with the feeling that someone could still be around. The silence of the dawn only made everything more suffocating, and I couldn't sleep anymore that day. The next morning, with daylight, I was able to observe the scene better. The footprints were really fresh, well-defined, and were clearly those of an adult. I followed the trail to the fence, but after that there was nothing else, as if the person had disappeared in the middle of the night. That left me with the feeling that somewhere nearby, maybe someone was watching, knowing exactly where I lived and how to get in. I told some neighbors and even the local police, but there wasn't much to do. The recommendation was just to reinforce security and be attentive. Even so, knowing that someone had really forced my door while I slept a few meters away was something difficult to process. The house, which always brought me peace, came to look vulnerable in a way I had never felt before. In the following days, I bought an extra lock and installed an improvised iron bar to hold the door inside. It gave me some sense of security, but the truth is that the fear didn't pass. Each pop of the wood or noise coming from the backyard made me get out of bed to check if someone was trying to get in again. It was like living in a state of constant alert. The most disturbing was to notice that, on 2 different nights, I heard footsteps outside near the fence, as if someone was wandering around the house. I could never confirm, because when I opened the curtain I didn't see anything. Still, the memory of the footprints in the mud left no doubt that someone had really been there, and that maybe he would still come back. Over time, the routine returned to normal, but I could never relax in the same way. Whenever I go to sleep, I check the back door more than once, as if that could prevent someone from trying to force entry again. The feeling of vulnerability inside my own house was marked, and to this day I have difficulty sleeping deeply without waking up at every noise. What scares me the most is thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that morning. Would the person have been able to enter completely? Was he after something specific, or just waiting for an opportunity? I never had answers, only the footprints disappearing on the fence and the certainty that someone tried to break in. And you, could you sleep peacefully after finding your forced door in the middle of the night? Story 6. In the first week I moved into the new apartment, I thought I had been lucky with the neighbors. The building was small, quiet, and the only thing that drew attention was the front neighbor, who loved listening to old music at high volume. It didn't bother me so much, since it happened more during the day, and I even found it curious to hear those songs coming from across the corridor. But after a few days, the situation was no longer just peculiar and began to worry me. I began to notice that, at dawn, someone whistled the same songs in the hallway. The sound was clear, prolonged, as if the person was standing right in front of my door. Whenever I opened it to check, the corridor was empty, and seconds later I heard the neighbor's door closing slowly. At first I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. It was always the same thing. The whistle began around 2 in the morning, never earlier, never later. And it wasn't just any melody. It was exactly the old songs he listened to during the day. The repetition made everything even more disturbing, as if it was done on purpose. Over time, I started waiting for the sound, even against my will. I was lying in bed, motionless, just listening to the whistle fill the silent corridor. There was no hurry, it was slow, almost calculated. The feeling that he was on the other side of the door, standing still, terrified me to the point of not being able to sleep properly. One night, I decided to get ready before it started. I left the lights in the living room on and stood near the door waiting. When the whistle started, I felt my heart speed up, but I took a deep breath and opened the door at once. The corridor was empty, but I immediately heard the click of the neighbor's door closing, very slowly, as if he had just returned inside. That was the confirmation I needed. It wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't my imagination, it was him. The idea that my neighbor spent the night in front of my door, whistling music in the dark, was enough to leave me on alert all the time. I went to sleep with the door locked twice, and even pushed a piece of furniture to reinforce, just to have the feeling of security. Even with all the precautions, the whistle continued. It was almost as if he knew that I was awake on the other side of the door, listening to every note. On some nights, I even recorded the sound on my cell phone, but whenever I thought about showing it to someone, I gave up, afraid of looking paranoid. Deep down, I knew that no one would understand the feeling of hearing that in the silence of the dawn. The worst was when once, I woke up with the whistle starting earlier than usual. It was just after 1 in the morning, and this time he didn't stay just a few minutes. The sound lasted for almost half an hour, going back and forth, as if he were walking down the corridor. I was completely paralyzed in bed, praying that I didn't have the courage to try something beyond that. After that night, I started planning my move, even without ideal financial conditions. The idea of continuing to live with someone who did that was unbearable. To this day I remember the feeling of opening the door and knowing that he was there seconds before, standing still, whistling as if it were a kind of message. I could never listen to those old songs again without feeling immediate chills. Experience has shown me that danger does not always come from explicit actions, Sometimes, someone's silent insistence is enough to destroy your peace. And you, what would you do if you noticed that your neighbor spent the night standing in front of your door, whistling music in the dark? Story 7. That night, I got home tired from work and came across an absurd scene. My neighbor's car was parked inside my garage, completely blocking the exit. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. After all, I had never given him permission to use my space. I went to his house to complain, and the answer was simply, "It's more convenient that way." That made me furious, but at the same time uncomfortable. It was obvious that he knew he was wrong, and yet he spoke with the greatest naturalness, as if there was no problem. I told him to take the car out immediately, and he ended up obeying, but the situation put me on alert. It seemed that it was not just a matter of parking, but something much stranger. The next day, when I left early for work, I realized something that made me even more uncomfortable. There were fresh tire marks on the sidewalk, right in front of my door. They were not old marks, they were recent, as if the car had been maneuvered there a few hours before. The detail that made me uneasy was that I was sure that no one should be there during the night. That night, I became more attentive and noticed again. As soon as I went to bed, I heard the low sound of an engine turning on and off nearby. I didn't see anything through the window, but the feeling was that someone was roaming my house on purpose. I immediately remembered the neighbor and the natural way he said that using my garage was more convenient. I began to wonder if that was not just an abusive parking lot, but a way to watch me. I decided to comment with other neighbors to see if anyone had already gone through a similar situation, but everyone said no. It made me even more uncomfortable, because it seemed like something directed only to me. It was as if he had chosen just my house to patrol, for no apparent reason. With each new tire brand on the sidewalk, the feeling of invasion grew. On the third night in a row, I decided to wait awake. I was with the light off, watching through the living room window. Around 2 a.m, I clearly saw the neighbor's car passing slowly in front of my house. He didn't stop, he just followed slowly, and then came back minutes later, as if he was turning around. There was no logical explanation for that behavior. The next morning, when I left for work, I noticed again the very cool tire marks at the entrance of my garage. It was as if he had stopped there on purpose, just to make me uncomfortable. With each new trail, I felt like it was a silent provocation, a way to show that I could appear at any time without me being able to avoid it. I talked to my family about it, and everyone agreed that it wasn't just a coincidence. Even because, if it was just lack of space, he would have parked somewhere else, but he never did. It was always in front of me, always at my entrance. The repetition made it impossible to believe that it was just a harmless habit. I even filed a complaint in the condominium, but I never had concrete evidence that it was around during the night, only the tire marks and my observations. Still, the simple idea that someone could use my garage and watch the front of my house at any time made me paranoid. I could never relax when I got home, always checking if there was any sign that the car had been there again. To this day, whenever I hear the sound of an engine late at night, I remember that uncomfortable feeling of being watched by someone who lived a few meters from me. The worst thing is to think that he never really explained the reason behind that behavior. And you, what would you do if you found out that your neighbor roamed your house at dawn, leaving clear signs that he was there? Story 8. I will never forget the day I received that summons. I opened the envelope and found out that my neighbor was suing me for emotional suffering caused by my dog's barking. She asked for an absurd compensation of $24,000. At first, I was more angry than scared because my dog was small, didn't bark all the time, and that clearly looked like an attempt at abuse. But what really scared me wasn't the process itself. It was her behavior after that. I started to notice that she was in the backyard for hours, standing still, just staring at my house. I didn't mess with my cell phone, I didn't take care of plants, I didn't do anything. I just stayed there motionless, watching me. Every day, the feeling of being watched became stronger. At first, I tried to ignore and follow my life normally. I talked to my lawyer about the process, but inside what really bothered me was her constant presence in the backyard. I came home from work and there was the neighbor, standing, looking as if she was waiting for me to notice. It was an empty, expressionless look, and it made me much more uncomfortable than any paper signed by a judge. There were days when she stood still for so long that I started to wonder if she was really in her right mind. My friends who came to visit me came to notice too, and the atmosphere got heavy instantly. No one wanted to spend a long time on the balcony or in the backyard, because it was impossible to relax with that motionless figure a few meters away. The strangest thing is that she never said anything. There were no insults, no direct complaints, just that silent vigil. Sometimes, when I tried to face back, she simply remained there, motionless, as if she didn't mind being caught in the act. It was as if I was trying to prove that I had some kind of control over the situation, and that made me more and more nervous. There was a night when I went out to take out the trash and realized that she was standing in the backyard, even in the dark. He didn't turn on any light, didn't make any movement, just followed me with his eyes until I went back inside. At that moment, I felt a real fear, as if it were not just a legal dispute, but a silent, calculated persecution. I started to avoid leaving the house at times when I knew she would be outside. I even changed small routines, such as watering the plants earlier or taking the dog for a walk at other times, just to not cross with that fixed gaze. But even so, it seemed that she always found a way to be present, as if she had learned my standards and was waiting for me. My dog also reacted. He growled low when he passed near the fence that separated the backyards, even without seeing anyone. It was as if he felt her presence before me. This only reinforced the feeling that that vigil was not something in my head. It was real, constant, and increasingly suffocating. The process took its course, but ended up not going very far because there was not enough evidence that my dog really caused any kind of disturbance. Even so, her attitude outside the court continued to bother me much more. It was as if the action had been just a pretext to justify his obsession with watching me. There was a time when I even took a picture of her standing in the backyard, just to show it to friends and family. Everyone was shocked by the scene, mainly because there was nothing natural in that posture. It wasn't someone enjoying the sun or taking care of the garden. It was just a motionless woman staring at my house, as if she was guarding every movement I made. Over time, I learned to live with that feeling of being watched, but I never really felt at ease inside my own house. The curtains started to stay closed almost all the time, and even my friends avoided coming to visit me because they said they felt the heavy weather. It was as if the process had ended on paper, but the persecution continued otherwise, much more disturbing. To this day, when I remember those moments when I opened the door and the road stopped, motionless, looking at me, I feel an immediate chill. Her silence was much more threatening than any word she could have said. And you, how would you react if you found out that your neighbor not only sued you, but also spent hours watching you in silence every day? Story 9. When I moved into that apartment, I thought it would be just another quiet period of rent. But in the first month, I started to notice something strange. Whenever I used the shower, I heard knocks on the side wall, as if the neighbor was uncomfortable. At first, I thought it was just an implication with the noise of the water or the pipe, so I didn't give much importance. But one night, everything changed. While taking a shower, I realized that, in addition to the beats, there was a different sound. It was a heavy, rhythmic breath that seemed to accompany every movement I made inside the box. The sound came straight from the wall, and it was impossible to ignore. The feeling of someone standing on the other side, listening to every detail, left me paralyzed. I stood there, motionless, trying to distinguish if it wasn't just a pipe effect, but soon I realized it couldn't be. The sound had pauses, rhythm, even small changes in intensity, as if it were really a person breathing. With each of my movements, when I turned the tap, when I moved my arm, the sound seemed to accompany, as if there was someone glued to the wall, paying attention to everything. I got out of the shower in a hurry, turning off the water in the middle, and stood in the room in silence, trying to listen. For a few seconds there was nothing, until 2 more dry knocks came on the wall, at the same point as always. It was like a direct message, almost a confirmation that I wasn't imagining anything. That night I almost couldn't sleep. I was lying staring at the ceiling, thinking about how that could be happening. The idea that someone was actually standing on the other side of the wall, listening to me, gave me goosebumps. I even thought about calling the building administration, but what would I say? That my neighbor was breathing through the wall while I was taking a shower? It seemed too absurd to be taken seriously. In the following days, I tried to vary the shower times to see if the pattern was repeated. And repeated. It didn't matter if it was early in the morning or late at night, there was always some kind of answer. Dry beats, or that heavy breath that seemed to intensify as I moved. This took away any feeling of privacy that I could have in my own apartment. One of the worst experiences happened on a Friday morning. I had just arrived from work and decided to take a quick shower before going to sleep. In the middle of the bath, breathing started again, but this time much closer, almost glued to the wall. Suddenly, I heard something that made me freeze. A slight scratch, as if nails were sliding on the surface, following the rhythm of my movement. I ran out of the bathroom. I didn't even bother to dry myself properly. I stood still in the living room, panting, listening in absolute silence. After a few seconds, 3 strong knocks came on the wall, so intense that they made the shelf tremble. That was the moment when I was absolutely sure that there was someone on the other side, conscious, trying to communicate or intimidate me. The next day, I got up the courage to cross paths with the neighbor in the hallway. He was an apparently ordinary man, but when I greeted him, he didn't answer anything. He just stared at me for a few seconds too long before silently going out of the building. That only confirmed my distrust. It wasn't a coincidence. He knew exactly what he was doing and seemed to be ashamed of it at all. I started to avoid using the bathroom at predictable times. I left the tap open in other rooms to try to confuse, but even so, whenever I used the shower, the beats came back. The most disturbing thing was that now I heard the breath even outside the bathroom, sometimes while brushing my teeth or just washing my hands, as if he had learned to follow any sound coming from there. After a few weeks, I couldn't take it anymore. I talked to the syndic and explained the situation in the most careful way possible, but there was never a concrete solution. Until the day I decided to move. I never had the courage to confront him directly, because the idea of being face to face with someone who spent nights breathing against the wall while I took a shower was simply too disturbing. To this day, every time I hear a strange sound coming from the plumbing or a crack on the walls, my body reacts on the spot, as if I were back in that bathroom. The feeling of being watched through a thin wall never left my head. And you? Could you live quietly knowing that your neighbor seems to follow your every movement, even in the most intimate moments? Story 10. But don't leave yet, because something unexpected comes after this one. That Tuesday morning, I went out to work like I did every day. When I got to the gate, I noticed a piece of folded paper attached with adhesive tape right at the height of my eyes. I opened it without giving much importance, but when I read it, I felt my stomach turn. "I know what time you arrive. Be careful." At the time, my hands trembled. I recognized the lyrics immediately. It was from the retired neighbor who spent all day sitting on the balcony, watching every movement of the street. I was already used to seeing his eyes following every time I entered or left the house, but I never imagined that he would turn this obsession into something so direct and disturbing. I stood there for a few minutes, looking at that note, not knowing if I should take it inside or throw it out. In the end, I put it in my bag and went to work trying to act normally, but the truth is that I couldn't concentrate on anything all day. The simple phrase, written almost sloppy, didn't leave my head. The care seemed more like a threat than a warning. When I got home that night, I noticed that he was there, as always, sitting on the balcony, looking in my direction. I felt a cold run through my body. It was as if I was waiting to see my reaction after reading the note. I went straight, trying not to show anything, but the feeling of being observed became even more intense. In the following days, the routine became unbearable. Whenever I got home from work, there he was, in the same chair, with the same fixed gaze. I never smiled, I never waved, I just followed my every step until I entered the house and closed the door. I started closing the curtains earlier, trying to block any eye contact, but I still felt that weight, as if there was someone watching every movement. The worst thing was when I realized that it wasn't just my impression. A neighbor casually commented that he spent hours looking in the direction of my house, without looking away. This only confirmed that it wasn't paranoia. He had really chosen me as the target of his attention. The ticket now made even more sense and more scary. I started to change small habits, like parking the car a little further away and varying the arrival times, but nothing seemed to help. He was always there, ready, as if he already knew when I would show up. Sometimes I had the impression that he even mentally wrote down the schedules, following every detail. This silent obsession left me with no way out, as if I had lost my freedom inside my own home. One night, while taking the garbage out, I saw a rapid movement on his balcony. When I looked, he was standing still, holding something in his hands. It looked like a notebook. For a few seconds, I was sure I was recording something about myself. I ran back inside the house and locked everything, with the feeling that I no longer had any control over my own routine. After this episode, I started to keep the ticket with me as a kind of proof, in case I needed to go to the police. The problem was that there was nothing explicit in it other than that short sentence, which made me even more distressed. It was direct, but at the same time vague enough to seem like just a strange comment if it was read out of context. This uncertainty made me even more trapped, not knowing if I was exaggerating or if I was really in danger. As the weeks went by, I realized that my body reacted automatically whenever I saw his silhouette on the balcony. My heart was racing, my breath was short, and I just wanted to hide inside the house. I could never use the backyard like before, because I felt his eyes accompanying me. The threat was not physical, but psychological, and this was undermining my tranquility day after day. Until today, I have never found another ticket, but the feeling of vigilance remains with me. Whenever I pass in front of his house, I feel that same chill, remembering the handwritten words. I know what time you arrive. Be careful. No matter how much time passes, the memory remains as clear as that day when I found the paper stuck in the gate. This experience taught me that true fear can come from simple gestures, but loaded with intention. And you, what would you do if you found out that a retired neighbor spent his days watching you and left a threatening note on your gate? You've made it to the end. Thank you for listening until now. But before we close, I have one last story for you. I've always had the habit of collecting clothes from the clothesline before going to sleep, especially on rainy days. On an ordinary night, while I was running to put everything together, I noticed a dirty t-shirt mixed with our pieces. She was clearly old and didn't belong to anyone in my family. I thought it was strange, but I figured it could have flown from some neighbor with the strong wind. Without thinking too much, I threw it away. But in the following days the situation was repeated, but in a more disturbing way. Other strange pieces began to appear on the clothesline, always different and each time in places closer to the back door. It wasn't as if they had fallen by chance. It was as if someone was putting that on purpose, almost trying to send a message. I told my wife, and at first she also thought it could just be some neighbor's lost clothes, but soon realized it didn't make sense. They were dirty, wet pieces, some even torn, and never repeated. Something new always appeared, always placed in a way that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't a coincidence, someone was messing with our backyard. Last time, the situation exceeded any limit. I went out to collect the training line on a rainy night, and as I approached the back door, I saw a heavy, soaked coat hanging directly on the kitchen latch. It wasn't thrown on the floor, it wasn't on the tin line, it was placed exactly where I would have to touch it to get in. It was as if someone had been there, stopped, leaving that as a warning. At that moment, I felt the blood freeze. It was no longer a situation that could be justified with wind or chance. Someone had crossed our backyard and put that coat right on the door on purpose. The detail that scared me the most was the state of the piece. It was wet, with a strong smell of wet earth, as if it had been used minutes before. I didn't have the courage to touch much. I just took it out with a broomstick and threw it away. I spent the night almost unclear, walking around the house from time to time to check if the doors and windows were well locked. With each pop of the wood, I got up, imagining that someone was outside. My wife was also in shock, and since then, we both have avoided even leaving clothes on the clothesline, afraid of what we might find again. In the following days, I became obsessed with trying to find out if someone was wandering around the house. I installed an improvised camera near the back door, but I was never able to capture anything concrete. The strange thing is that, even without new clothes appearing, I still felt the same tension every time I looked at that point in the kitchen. It was as if the simple fact that the coat had been there had turned the place into something threatening. What disturbed me the most was imagining the person standing there, in silence, choosing exactly where to hang the piece. To think that someone managed to get so close without us noticing, and still having time to organize that was terrifying. I kept checking my mind every previous night, trying to remember some noise that I could have ignored, but there was never anything. I even talked to some neighbors to see if they had noticed a strange one circulating on the street, but no one had seen anything. This only increased my distrust that I was not just any stranger. Maybe it was someone from there, someone who knew well the hours of our house. This possibility was even more frightening, because it made it impossible to know who to trust. My wife suggested that we call the police, but what would I have to show? A dirty t-shirt, some strange clothes on the clothesline, and finally, a wet coat on the door latch. Without proof of who had left that, it seemed too banal a situation to receive attention. But for me, who lived every detail, there was nothing banal. It was a silent invasion, made to make us insecure. After this episode, we reinforced all the locks and even installed spotlights with motion sensor, but the feeling of vulnerability never disappeared. The simple act of going to the back door at night began to be accompanied by a real fear, as if at any moment I could find another strange object left there on purpose. We never saw clothes appear again, but the uncertainty about who did that continues. To this day I wonder what was the intention behind those objects. Was it a sick joke? A form of veiled threat? Or was someone really trying to scare us on purpose? We never got an answer. And you? How would you react if you found strange clothes being left closer and closer to your house, until a wet coat appeared hanging on the latch of your door? Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.